Welcome everybody to this week's review session, and this review session will cover lectures 5 and 6, and those cover plate tectonics and geology, as well as fossils and paleontology, and then the first half of the geologic history of Antarctica. And I will be finishing up the geologic history of Antarctica in the lecture that I record and post later tonight. That's not covered on this review session. So there is a lab due this Friday on April 23rd, and that is largely going to be based on lecture 5, and I will have a couple pointers in this session for how to prepare for lab 3 while using the lecture material. You've just taken lecture quiz number 1. Congratulations on that. You should be able to see your results by Tuesday at the latest, and that will give you a sense of what sort of questions are going to come up on the upcoming midterm. There is one other assignment due this week, the first of the 2 writing assignments, the reading assignments, in which you write in response to a news article or a non-academic article about Antarctica. That is due this Sunday, April 25th. A few people have submitted already. I'll have the guidelines again on the next slide. But you are very welcome to send me ideas for articles if you want to get a sense of whether something is the right article. I am very open to what you pick. It, again, just needs to be a reliable source. It needs to be something that you can write more than 400 words about. And it needs to be something that you find interesting, because that will almost certainly make it more easier for you to do. As for the midterm, that will open on Monday, April 26th and close on Sunday, May 2nd. So it will open next Monday. The study guide for that is already posted, actually. It has some terms from lecture 8, which I will not get to until Wednesday. But if you want to start looking at that, the study guide is up and posted on Gaucho Space now. And in office hours next Monday on April 26th, I will be recording lecture 9, which is the midterm exam review lecture, in office hours, and you are welcome to come to that and ask questions at that. It will not take up the whole office hours period, so there will be time afterwards for people to just chat with me if they need to. And there will not be any new material presented next week. There'll be lecture 9 on review on Monday, and then there'll just be a sort of fun / breather lecture happening on Wednesday. Any questions? So for assignment number 1, you saw the slide set before, but this assignment is to find an article from a newspaper or a popular news source about Antarctica from within the last decade, so 2010, 11-ish onwards, and your response is pretty open. It just needs to be greater than 400 words, and there's a couple of points you need to address. You need to address what the main point of the article was. You need to address what is something you read about that you had not previously known about Antarctica. And you need to write about what was interesting about this article to you. And very importantly, your response needs to have a link to the article somewhere. You submit this via Gaucho Space. Reading assignment 1 is located under the tab for week 4, the week of the quarter that we're presently in. And you simply put your response in the submission window there. You can absolutely compose it in a Word document before, especially if you want to check the word count, but don't email it to me. Put it in the assignment box on Gaucho Space itself. And the TAs and I will grade that ASAP once they're posted. There's also a bit of a list on the assignment itself of ways that we commonly see students lose points and ways to avoid that, like not meeting the word count, or using the article of the title excessively to meet the word count, or just simply not addressing any of the points that we ask you to. And again, pick something that you're interested in. Some of the articles that I've been assigning you, I've said, this is a good article this is a good article for assignment number 1. And that gives you a sense of what I'm looking for, as opposed to the more academic and slightly heavier articles that you would do for assignment number 2. And I am absolutely okay with silly articles, with somewhat silly articles, as long as they are accurate and as long as they're there's some academic reason behind them. Somebody did actually submit this article about penguin poop, and they got full credit on it. Anyhow, any questions about assignment number 1? Okay then. So as for last week's material, we learned a lot of geology. We covered a lot during lecture 5, but here is a good summary of the important points along the way and what it was all leading to. We learned a bit about the structure of the Earth and how it's physically structured into layers. And the outermost two are the most important for this class because we learn how plates made of a rigid solid, the lithosphere, which is the crust and the uppermost part of the mantle, move on top of the asthenosphere, which is a warmer and softer but still solid part of the mantle. And this is a relatively recent development that we know this. The theory of plate tectonics was preceded by a hypothesis of continental drift, basically a hypothesis that the continents had moved around, that some of them had been connected previously, that some of them are not where they are now. And the main bits of evidence found for that were 4 of them, mainly fossils of the same or really similar organisms found on widely separate continents, and with it being very clear that these were not marine organisms that could have swum across the Atlantic Ocean or swum across the Southern Ocean. In addition, there was the fact that many of the continents had coastlines that seemed to fit together extremely well, to the point where it seemed that they had once been connected and that it wasn't simply a coincidence. They also found glaciers that had clearly been at sea level, like the ones they have in Antarctica and Greenland today, in continents that are nowhere near the South Pole today. And that actually was later recognized as evidence for Snowball Earth, for the period in Earth's history way early on in the Precambrian, when the entire planet was covered in ice during the most extreme ice age that the Earth has had. And lastly, they found mountains separated by oceans that had similar structures, as well as the same rocks. Many of these same rocks having the same fossils in them. So I have an example question about continental drift here, and that is Glossopteris is a seed fern whose fossils have been found in Antarctica, as well as elsewhere. Which of the following is not something implied by the presence of these fossils in Antarctica as well as elsewhere? A, Antarctica used to be warmer. B, Antarctica was not always so close to the South Pole. C, Antarctica was attached to other continents previously. D, Antarctica is not a craton. E, Antarctica was once wetter. And indeed, the answer is D, because Antarctica is indeed a craton. It's a piece of continental crust that has been together since the Precambrian, but that's sort of true regardless of whether you find Glossopteris fossils or not, and that doesn't really directly have to do with any of this. But fossils found in Antarctica indicates that it used to be warmer. It's inhospitably cold now. It also was not always as close to the South Pole. It was also attached to other continents because you find these fossils elsewhere. And Antarctica was also wetter because it once had enough rainfall to support forests. So yes, that's the type of questions I might ask about continental drift, or that's an example of the type of question I might ask. So does anybody have questions about continental drift that they came away from the lecture with that I haven't addressed here? Continental drift led more or less directly into plate tectonics, which is the theory that came out of it once a mechanism was discovered. And what had to be discovered were mid-ocean ridges, places in the middle of the ocean where new oceanic crust specifically is generated. And the discovery of seafloor spreading showed a mechanism for how, for example, South America and Africa were pushed apart over geologic time, or how Antarctica was pushed apart from Australia and South America and the other southern continents over geologic time. And as people began to look for more evidence, they discovered that if you looked at the rocks on either side of these mid-ocean ridges, they had the same age, which indicated that you had magma bubbling up at the center and rock cooling on either side and spreading to either side. it would make sense that the ages of the rocks would be symmetrical on either side, that you'd have the youngest ones in the center and progressively older rocks on either side in a symmetrical pattern. They also discovered that the density drops as you move away. The density of the rocks drops as you move away from the mid-ocean ridges because the rock is cooler, and you also get a symmetrical signature of reversals in Earth's magnetic field. So in general, the theory of plate tectonics states that new oceanic crust is created at spreading centers and then recycled at subduction zones. The crust that makes up the continent is quite chemically different and is mostly actually generated by volcanism that is incited at subduction zones, and it does not subduct. Plate tectonics as a whole are driven by a combination of ridge push and slab pull, sort of a perpetual motion cycle that is caused by the gradient that you get from the density differences away from the mid-ocean ridge, as well as the weight of the subducting plate. And this is kept going by convection of material inside of the mantle. And remember that convection refers to when heat transfer occurs via a substance moving around. Hot air or magma or water rises, and cooler air or magma or water sinks. And that is what is going on inside of the Earth's mantle. Now, this is actually a diagram you'll be seeing for the lab this week if you haven't looked at it already. Notice I've put a couple stars on here for emphasis. So in the diagram shown to the above right, in this example question, the stars locate mid-ocean ridges. What is true about the mid-ocean ridges among these following statements? A, oceanic crust is being recycled at mid-ocean ridges. B, no volcanism occurs at mid-ocean ridges. C, the crust is oldest at the mid-ocean ridges. D, the crust is youngest at the mid-ocean ridges. And E, Antarctica is an active margin. And the answer, again, here is D. The crust is youngest at the mid-ocean ridges, and that's something you can see from looking at this diagram. A, we can rule out because subduction, aka when the crust goes into the trenches, is when crust is recycled. It's being made at mid-ocean ridges. And if it's being made, you have volcanism. It is fundamentally volcanoes erupting. The crust is not oldest at the mid-ocean ridges. That doesn't make sense because that's where the magma is first erupting and cooling into oceanic crust. And Antarctica is not an active margin. And that's something I didn't directly address here, but if on the slide at least, but Antarctica is miles and miles away from mid-ocean ridges that are out in the ocean and that are continuing to push it farther and farther away from the continents that it used to be attached to. And I will talk a little bit about passive versus active margins on the next slide.
So I'm a little confused why there isn't a star where the trans-Antarctic mountains are, because doesn't that also suggest like two plates are there?
That's a good question. The Transantarctic Mountains were actually, so the Transantarctic Mountains are going to be here, and they were actually, when this rift first started forming, they were pushed up, and they are not being presently pushed up. The push up that made the Transantarctic Mountains happened millions of years ago, and it's still exposed because they haven't been worn down all that much yet, but there isn't a plate boundary now. They are now very far from the plate boundary at which they formed because so much new crust has formed in the process.
Okay.
And that's what I mean by a passive margin, because a passive margin used to be a plate boundary. It used to be at the center of everything where the mid-ocean ridge, where the spreading center was first forming. But as new crust formed, it pushed the continent farther and farther out until the shoreline of the continent itself, aka the margin, is no longer right along the plate boundary.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Now going on to different types of plate boundaries, we have three of them. We have divergent plate boundaries, where you have new oceanic crust being formed at a spreading center or a mid-ocean ridge, and that's where you have the plates moving away from each other. And spreading center and mid-ocean ridge, I kind of use interchangeably. I do have to be careful with that because the spreading centers technically only refer to the divergent segments, and a mid-ocean ridge contains various divergent segments that are staggered, kind of in a zigzag pattern, and the spreading center segments are connected by one of the other types of plate boundaries, the transform plate boundaries. And in Antarctica, the continent is surrounded by spreading centers out in the ocean. Antarctica's coastline now is a passive margin because where the land in Antarctica meets the sea is not the plate boundary itself. The plate boundary was there millions of years ago geologically, because at one point Antarctica was attached to other continents, and then a spreading center formed on the boundary of what is on basically in the middle of, say, the continent made of both Antarctica and Australia. And it began to make new oceanic crust and push the continents farther apart until ocean filled in. And that spreading is still going on. The ocean between Antarctica and Australia, as well as between the Southern Ocean, is getting wider essentially because of seafloor spreading. But the coast of Antarctica itself is not actually where the plate boundary is anymore. It was many years ago, but since the ocean has spread out so much between the two continents, it's not anymore. At a convergent plate boundary, you have plates colliding, and you have either subduction or continental collision. And that what you get at a convergent boundary relates to what type of crust you have, because oceanic crust is produced at mid-ocean ridges, and it is very dense and can subduct back into the mantle. Continental crust, which is produced by volcanic eruptions at subduction zones largely, notice that while the oceanic crust is going down, there's a volcano here. And continental crust is not dense enough to sink back into the mantle. And so actually, the amount of continental crust has steadily increased over geologic time. If you have a plate composed of oceanic crust, meeting one made of continental crust, you get subduction. The oceanic plate will go down because the oceanic plate is always going to be more dense than the continental plate. You do have a situation on the left side of this diagram where you have two plates made of oceanic crust, and one of them is subducting. So you have two plates, and they both have oceanic crust on them. The crust on one of the plates is going to be younger than the crust on the other, even though they're both oceanic. So if one is older than the other, which one is going to subduct? The plate with older oceanic crust or the plate with younger oceanic crust? Which is more dense? Yes, precisely. It's going to be the older plate, because the older oceanic crust has been cooled longer. It's been cooled longer, and it's going to be at least slightly denser than the younger oceanic crust, and so it will subduct. So that's what happens. So that's what's happening over here. And you also get a chain of volcanoes. You get this island chain of volcanoes forming. Now, this diagram doesn't show it, but if you have two plates that are made of continental crust colliding, you get mountain building. You get a situation like we have in the Himalayas presently. And we have had many episodes of continental collision in Antarctica in the past that we talked about in lecture 6 a fair bit, when I talked about the building of Antarctica and how strips of crust were rafted and collided onto the pre-existing crust until Antarctica reached about its present size. And we have, I would say, less continental collision now than we used to, but there is continental collision going on now in the Himalaya between the boundary of India and the rest of Asia. Not going on in Antarctica right now presently, but we have evidence of it happening in the past. And we do have some subduction happening in Antarctica. We have a couple places in the subantarctic islands where ocean crust is subducting under other ocean crust and generating island arcs like the subantarctic islands, like South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. Those are all volcanoes formed from subduction. The last type of plate boundary is a transform boundary, where the plates slide past each other and neither of them moves up or down. They instead just essentially move in opposite directions, and no crust is created via volcanism, nor is any recycled via subduction. And they largely function as the connector segments between the staggered between the staggered spreading centers along a mid-ocean ridge. And in Antarctica, they are found in the spreading centers that surround the continent out in the Southern Ocean. And a fracture zone is simply a dead or inactive transform fault that extends far out, like beyond the reach of the spreading center. And you don't have to worry too much about fracture zones. They will come up a little bit more in the lab, and on the next slide, I'll have a diagram that might help a little bit with understanding why a fracture zone is not a plate boundary. But we also have hotspots where you have a volcano erupting through the Earth's crust away from a plate boundary, where you simply have, and this diagram actually does show a hotspot. There's just simply a plume of mantle material rising and producing a volcano. And you get this chain of islands where there's only one active volcano above where the hotspot is now. And since the plate moves, but the hotspot doesn't, you'll get this chain of dead volcanoes extending behind that used to be above the hotspot, but have now been moved away from it by the plate. They also can happen on land. Yellowstone is a good example of a hotspot that occurs on land. And in Antarctica, we have a hotspot above Ross Island forming Mount Erebus. So we do have some active volcanoes in Antarctica near the coast, but they are not caused by a plate boundary. They're caused by a hotspot. And there's also some active volcanoes in the peninsula caused by hotspots. So an example question on here, which I realize the answer is in here, but this is the kind of question you might see. And true or false, all convergent boundaries, whether oceanic or continental crust is present, involve subduction and the recycling of crust. So would that be true or false? When you have two plates coming together, do you always have subduction? And indeed, it is false, because you sometimes have two continental plates colliding, and that produces mountain building. The plates don't go down, they go up. The crust literally gets thicker and forms mountains like the Himalaya, or like mountains produced during past orogenies in Antarctica. So questions about plate boundary types.
How common are convergent plate boundaries that result in mountains compared to subduction?
I'd say you get subduction much more, because 2 out of 3 times you get subduction. Ocean, you get subduction. Ocean continent, you get subduction. Continent, you get collision.
And is it possible to have a convergent plate boundary that initially results in a mountain and then kind of subducts into the other?
It usually happens the other way around, where you have, let's say there's a continent and there's another continent and there's ocean between them, and one continent is getting closer to the other one, and so the ocean between the two is subducting, and then when the continent hits, subduction stops and you get mountain building.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. You don't usually have the other way around. So as for this week's lab draws heavily on lecture 5, and the TAs have a presentation that does a nice job of summarizing what is most useful to review for this lab. My lecture covers a broader scope of things than does the lab itself, because the lab itself is relatively short, all things considered. And so for the fracture zones, don't overthink them too much. Fracture zones exist as a product of the geometry. The mid-ocean ridges are staggered zigzag-wise, in that you have, so this cross-section shows that here you have a section where you have divergence. This is a divergent plate boundary because you have new crust being formed at the center and then spreading out on either side. And instead of going straight up, there is a segment connecting this mid-ocean ridge, or this spreading center segment, with another spreading center segment, so that they're staggered slightly. And on the lower side of this plate boundary, you have the crust moving in this direction, sort of to the lower left of the screen. And so on this side of the plate boundary, the crust is moving this way. On this side of the plate boundary, the crust is moving towards the upper right of the screen. It's moving in this direction. And one thing to notice is that you can kind of think of there being, the plate boundary is kind of continuous, even though it behaves a little bit differently along its length. Assuming you can see the cursor right now, I am following the plate boundary. And that's why it's marked as B over here, and this is also B. This is A over here, and this is also A. Now, there isn't really any plate movement occurring on the fracture zone itself. The fracture zone exists because it is possible for these transform segments to get shorter or longer, and for this divergent segment to get either farther or closer from this divergent or closer to this divergent segment. And the fracture zone is evidence that this transform fault has been wider in the past. It's been more spread out, and you have broken up rock as evidence of past plate movement. But at the present, there's a crack there, but there's not movement occurring on either side of it. The crust above this fracture zone is moving to the lower left, and so is the crust below this fracture zone. And don't overthink them too much, because we don't really, we get into the idea that fracture zones and spreading and transform segments change length over time, but we don't get into why. And a lot of that has to do with patterns in mantle convection that we don't really get into in this class. So any questions about this or about the lab? Again, do make sure that you check out the material under files needed for the lab, because that will summarize what's useful for that will summarize what material is most useful for the lab. Now, as for the first half of lecture 6, this is a list of the key terms from it. We are looking forward going to be doing a lab on the rocks of Antarctica, as well as one on the fossils of Antarctica. And lecture 6A especially will be good to review for those labs, because it goes over a little bit the different types of rocks and a little bit about fossils. So in this half of the lecture, we covered igneous versus sedimentary versus metamorphic rocks. Igneous rocks being rocks that form as magma originally. Sedimentary rocks being those that form when mud, sand, or other sediment lithifies and solidifies into rock. And then metamorphic rocks, like this gneiss here, that form when previously existing rocks get drastically changed by heat and pressure. We talked about how you can date rocks differently using either radioactivity to determine how old the rock is by looking at the minerals in it, which is usually easiest for igneous rocks, because the minerals formed as the magma cools, and the mineral formation date is roughly when the rock itself solidified. Sedimentary rocks, we cannot usually do that because they're made of sediment. They're made of broken up pieces of other rock. And even if we do find, say, a zircon crystal that was eroded from an igneous rock, what is the date on that zircon? The zircon is one of the minerals we do absolute dating with. If we find a zircon in a sandstone, what date is that giving us? Is that giving us the date at which the sandstone formed, or is that giving us the date at which the igneous rock that eroded to form that sandstone first formed? So it gives us the date that the rock that eroded to form the sandstone forms. Sedimentary rocks are fundamentally made up of broken pieces of other rock. The sand and mud, the sediments, originally were broken down from other rocks. So that's why we use relative dating for sedimentary rocks. We use principles such as the principle of superposition. We say that rocks that are above other rocks are younger, or that if we have a feature that cuts across a series of layered rocks, that feature is younger than the layers of rocks. we talked a bit about the rock record and the fossil record and how we have only a small percentage of remnants, how the fossil remnants we have, the remnants of ancient life, are likely a very small percentage of the full diversity of life that has existed over the geologic timescale, especially considering that older rocks are hard to find. They either ocean rocks get subducted, continental rocks get buried by newer rocks, and when they get buried, they get metamorphosed. And do we normally find fossils most in igneous, sedimentary, or metamorphic rocks between the three? You find them in sedimentary rocks, because if you imagine that if a dinosaur fell into magma, the bones and what was left of it would just melt away. The only exception is that sometimes ash, like from Mount St. Helens or Pompeii, does bury fossils without completely incinerating them. But usually it's a case of a clamshell that was from a clam that was living on the ocean floor. The shell ends up being buried in sand, or a dead dinosaur gets washed into a river and buried in mud, or you find fossils of shells and limestone in some cases. And fossils are any evidence of past life, but they can either be body fossils, or something that shows us the actual physical form of the dead organism, or they can be trace fossils that show behavior, like footprints or burrows or stromatolites, which are the structures that blue-green algae build that we learned about, or fossil poop. Or eggs are kind of borderline, I guess. I think eggs are considered body fossils because they're a part of the embryonic organism. But whether we have trace or body fossils, we can use fossils to determine what type of place is represented by the rocks we find. The depositional environment of a sedimentary rock is what type of place the rock formed, what type of place the sediments that make up the rock were deposited in, whether it's a deep ocean setting or a lake setting or a desert setting or a forest setting. And in addition to looking at the features of the rock itself, like the size of the grains, we can also look at fossils. And for example, the presence of petrified wood tells us that there used to be a forest there. The presence of clams or coral or brachiopods tells us that there used to be an ocean there. So as one example question, the age of the granite in the picture on the lower right, one of my Antarctic granites actually, can be determined by radioactive decay in minerals. What technique is this? A, stratigraphy. D, absolute dating is the correct answer. I realize I've put a bunch of them as D. I got to watch that for the midterm. But yes, it is absolute dating. It's not stratigraphy, which stratigraphy and relative dating are kind of the same thing in a sense. Stratigraphy just refers to the study of layers of rocks relative to one another, and relative dating is using that to determine ages compared to one another. Lithification just means turning into a rock, and stratification is a general term for layer separation. And I used that in this class when I was talking about different layers in the ocean being separated earlier. So not what we're talking about here. Any questions here that I haven't already addressed, or that you came into this session wanting to ask? The last thing I covered last week was the first half of the geologic history of Antarctica and the world also, because I did cover some important geologic events that have evidence exposed in Antarctica, but that applied to the world as a whole. Roughly in chronological order, I covered the building of Antarctica and the building of the Antarctic craton, the mass that makes up the Antarctic continent, and the series of orogenies or mountain building events that did so. And in itself, that's interesting because we don't have continental collision in Antarctica today, but we have evidence from rocks and from ancient structures that was going on in Precambrian time. And Precambrian time refers to the earliest part of Earth's history, before the event known as the Cambrian Explosion, when most modern groups of life appeared. We learned about how the early Earth was in a very inhospitable place. largely because there was very little free oxygen available in the air. And also because as a result of that, there wasn't much of an ozone layer. And so ultraviolet radiation was much more of a problem. Life originated in the ocean, and it was, to begin with, microscopic single-celled life, what we would definitely consider extremophiles today, life that can survive under conditions of very low oxygen, which will kill just about anything else. Complex life, like us, these lovely dimetrodons here, and the trees growing in the back of this, rely on oxygen to at least some extent for cell respiration, to produce food, to convert sugars into energy. And many extremophiles can instead use other chemical reactions to generate energy. Cyanobacteria were one of these, and cyanobacteria are actually photosynthetic. They are one of the few, cyanobacteria are single-celled algae that they do live on their own sometimes still, but they also exist inside the cells of plants performing the photosynthesis in there, which I think is rather fascinating. There was the one slide I had where I talked a little bit about how the ancestors to plants engulfed cyanobacteria without destroying the cyanobacteria, and they developed a symbiotic relationship with them. And that's how more complex organisms like land plants can photosynthesize. But the discovery of stromatolites, which are those trace fossils made by layers upon layers of cyanobacteria growing and leaving behind sand, are some of the first fossils we have, and also some of the first evidence we have that the Earth was starting to become oxygenated. And in general, our study of ancient life is really hampered by the poor fossil record, and also if we don't have anything to compare it to. And the good news is that we have stromatolites today, including in Antarctica, including in some very extreme environments in Antarctica, like some ice-covered lakes, because there's not a lot of other life there. And indeed, cyanobacteria were some of the first life, and there weren't more complex organisms grazing on them. So the cyanobacteria led to the Great Oxidation Event, when Earth's atmosphere first began to be oxygenated, and that caused the iron in the ocean to bond with the oxygen and go from being dissolved in the water to forming a solid and settling out of the water or precipitating. And that made the banded iron formations where you would have rust-colored ocean sediments from the iron falling out of the water. And then the ocean sediments would go back to being gray mud for a while because the oxygen had been mostly used up, but the cyanobacteria kept producing oxygen. And so this cycle of back and forth went on for more than 1 billion years. It went on for quite a while, even though it's labeled as the Great Oxidation Event as something that happened quickly. It's really kind of a period in Earth's history. Eventually, the iron in the ocean equilibrated with the oxygen in the atmosphere, and the oxygen in the atmosphere began to build up slowly. And it would eventually build up enough to the point where more complex life began to evolve. Another event that occurred during this time was Snowball Earth, the period in which a combination of Milankovitch cycles and plate tectonics led to runaway albedo. It led to ice sheets forming and reflecting enough solar radiation away that Earth became cold enough that you had glaciers at the equator and you had the ocean more or less frozen over. And this life didn't completely go extinct during Snowball Earth, but it limited the development of more complex life for quite a while. And the Cambrian Explosion comes not that long after the end of Snowball Earth, and it also occurs about when Earth's atmospheric oxygen levels start to approach modern levels. And so those two events seem to have set the stage for the Paleozoic era, or the ancient life era, and the development of more complex marine organisms. The Cambrian Explosion, you see arthropods, the group that includes insects and spiders, show up. You see mollusks, the group that includes octopuses and clams, show up. You see ancestral fish show up. You see early corals show up. You see life that we can recognize as being related to modern groups show up. And I bring up Rodinia because it's a good example of the fact that Pangaea, which is what most people think of when they think of a supercontinent, when they think of all the continents being joined, wasn't actually the first supercontinent. Earth's continents cycle between being mostly joined and being mostly separate. Presently, they're mostly separate. During much of the pre-Cambrian era, before the Cambrian Explosion, the continents were connected as another supercontinent called Rodinia, and during that period, it's believed that Antarctica was actually attached to southwestern North America because we have similar rocks in both places from the same era. And that's the foundation for the sweat hypothesis, or the Southwest America is attached to East Antarctica hypothesis. We skimmed over a fair bit because, frankly, the fossil record from Antarctica is not that great, and there's a lot of interesting tidbits about marine life, but not anything really dramatic until the land starts to be colonized. And you get the formation of what are known as the coal swamps when you have forests covering the continents for the first time, including in Antarctica. And it's hot, it's steamy, you have very high atmospheric oxygen levels, you get giant insects, you get vast growths of plants, and there's so much plant growth that the dead plants, instead of decaying completely, they get buried and they start to be converted into coal as opposed to decaying away. So the Carboniferous period is when most coal formed worldwide. After the Carboniferous, the continents were again joined into Pangaea, and you actually get ice sheets forming for part of the Permian period, especially over the South Pole. And Antarctica wasn't quite at the South Pole by this time, but it was approaching it. It was most directly connected to the other southern continents, Australia and South America and Africa during this time. But the Permian period is when you first get large land animals, and you don't get dinosaurs, even though these guys, Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus, fun fact, these are different genuses. Edaphosaurus, which is the one in the background, ate plants. Dimetrodon, this one with the nice teeth here, ate meat. These are not dinosaurs, they are synapsids. They are part of the group that includes us mammals. And synapsids were actually the first dominant land animals, but they would decline drastically after the Permian extinction, after the Siberian traps, which were a very large volcanic eruption, ignited a very large amount of the coal that had previously been formed during the Carboniferous, leading to runaway greenhouse gases, leading to an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that led to ocean acidification. And the global warming definitely hurt life on land. The synapsids really declined, even though they did not completely go away, as evidenced by the fact that we are technically synapsids and mammals did evolve. They just ceased to be the dominant life form for the period after this. But marine life was really drastically affected by this. Now, the example question is one that might test you to know what sort of organisms would actually do this. So, banded iron formations from the Precambrian show that significant amounts of oxygen were being produced by what organisms for the first time in Earth's history? A, synapsids, B, cyanobacteria, C, Glossopteris seed ferns, D, redwood trees, or E, fish. And a couple of these you can rule out pretty quickly because they don't photosynthesize. Synapsids do not photosynthesize. We can't make our own food, nor can fish. And then for the first time in Earth's history is meant to indicate that we are talking about primitive extremophiles. We're not talking about the plants that you'd find in forests. We're talking about the little single-celled algae that first made oxygen on Earth. So yes, B is the correct answer. And the Earth history part of this class is kind of like a highlights reel in many ways, and I do my best to connect the different events, but there is a lot that I'm skipping, I will admit. And I'm very happy to talk about stuff that I skipped, or if there's anything that I missed, because there is a lot of interesting stuff I don't really have time to go over. So any questions about this? I just have one more slide. Looking forward to the midterm exam after this. So as for the midterm, It will open next Monday, and I will have this slide also in the upcoming lecture that I'll be recording for today. There will be a review session next week that is what I will be uploading and recording as lecture 9. So that's going to be one of the very few times I do a synchronous lecture, and I will be recording it and posting it for people who can't be there, obviously, but that's going to be a review session focused on everything we've covered up to this point, including the lecture 8 on marine life that I will release on Wednesday. And it's going to consist of 50 questions. They're all going to be either multiple choice or true or false. You'll have 75 minutes to take the test, and that's what you would have if you were taking this in class. It is a closed notes exam, so study the lecture slides and your notes first. The material is going to be drawn mostly from lecture slides and lecture videos. There will be a small handful of questions related to the climate articles and paleontology articles, as well as these video clips, but I will be writing those to connect them to lecture subjects. And for the review session next Monday, I'll give some examples of questions on the midterm that might relate to the movies or articles to give you a sense of what you should focus on. And there is a study guide posted. The study guide is a pretty exhaustive list of anything that you might expect a more detailed question on. And it's organized by lecture. It's organized by topic and by lecture slide, by lecture number. So if terms on the study guide don't make sense to you, then it's a good time to go back to the lecture that the terms came from and see where it shows up and what the significance is. So that's our review session for today. Does anybody have more questions?
So does that mean there won't be any free response questions on the?
No, there will not be on the midterm.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Nice to see you all, and I will post this and I will see you soon.